Well, the American people have spoken all at once, really loudly. Didn't quite make out what they said. But in any case, it looks like we're headed for the nightmare scenario. Let's discuss. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Well, the season finale of Trump Season 1 ended on the kind of cheesy, highly unlikely cliffhanger that gets you wondering what sort of hacks are even writing this stuff. And we're sure to be tuning in to the first episode of the next season when it all gets resolved. Although we won't know until then whether it's Trump Season 2 or Biden 1. If Trump goes out, he's going to go out with a bang, having massively overperformed over what the polls were predicting. But where that's left us is peering into the abyss of what I floated in an earlier video as the nightmare scenario, where it comes down to a few swing states. The on-the-day ballots mostly favour Trump in those states, but then as the mail-in ballots already flagged in advance by Trump as the likely mechanism for fraud, as they get counted, those results flip, and that's what causes Biden to win. Half the American people are jubilant, half are 100% convinced there has just been fraud and it is a stolen election. And unfortunately, whatever you think are Trump's strong points, and I do think he has a number that are given little credit, his lack of leadership will lead him to push that line hard, reckless of the potentially inflammatory consequences. We already got a taste of this, with Trump saying a disgraceful thing, but then the media immediately distorting that to make it into an even more inflammatory thing.
And all of a sudden everything just stopped. This is a fraud on the American public. This is an embarrassment to our country. We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election. So our goal now is to ensure the integrity for the good of this nation. This is a very big moment. This is a major fraud in our nation. We want the law to be used in a proper manner. So we'll be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We want all voting to stop. We don't want them to find any ballots at 4 o'clock in the morning and add them to the list. Okay?
And of course, the disgraceful thing is declaring victory before the votes have all been counted. There is no excuse for this. It's dumb politics at best. And sensible Trump-supporting Republicans were quick to go public in condemning this. Here's Ben Shapiro, for instance. No, Trump has not already won the election, and it is deeply irresponsible for him to say that he has. And that's right. Saying that you've won and saying that there's definitely fraud going on even before the counts have actually finished and in the absence of any evidence, that is just setting us up for real trouble. Others, such as Chris Christie, also pitched in to say the same thing. None of this gets made easier when the left then seize on his words, as they have done so often for the last 4 years, misrepresenting them in a way to make them even worse. So, for instance, Joe Biden's campaign manager, Jen O'Malley-Dillon, said this: "The president's statement tonight about trying to shut down the counting of duly cast ballots was outrageous, unprecedented, and incorrect." That, of course, wasn't what he said. He said stop the voting, not stop the counting. This comes from those states yet to declare that have agreed that mail-in ballots can be counted up to 9 days after Election Day, and a suspicion that means that desperate Democrats might well organise fraudulent votes, having seen how crucial the outcome will be. But the line that the president meant counting, not voting, has gained wide currency, and they're arguing that he said that the count should just be stopped and the presidency just given to him. Even Jim Naughtie of the BBC repeated that, calling it the most extraordinary thing ever said, which it would have been, but that's not what he meant. I criticised the agreement that those late ballots could be counted last week, and this is exactly the scenario why it was such a colossally stupid decision. It is now certain that whoever wins, once all the wrangling and the legal challenges are done, half of the country will be utterly fixed in the view of their political illegitimacy. How hard can this be, America? You can send men into space, and yet you can't organise to count votes within 1 day of an election? In the UK, we vote on bits of paper. There is a secure system for transferring votes to be counted, where they're counted in front of all the candidates so they can check it's done properly, and it gets done. We go to bed the night of the election, we wake up in the morning and we hear the result. The system has to be robust for exactly this reason. If people don't trust the results, if people who lose won't go peacefully, you don't have a democracy. You invented this stuff. How can you be so bad at it? America, of course, also invented opinion polling. And you could be asking the same question there. In fact, you'd have to say that the massive loser of the night was the opinion polling organisations that now have zero remaining credibility. They said Biden would cruise to victory in Florida on an 8.4% lead. And he lost. They said Biden was on course for a landslide. And they'd corrected for all the problems they had last time, so this time they would be more accurate. Well, even if he wins, this was surely no landslide. Salvatore Babones, writing for the Sydney Morning Herald, said that the polls will never be right again because so few people are actually now talking to the pollsters. Very few people answer their phone to unlisted numbers these days, and those that do increasingly refuse to answer pollsters' questions. The Pew Research Centre reports that its response rates have dived from 36% 2 decades ago to just 6% now, and commercial pollsters are speculated to be down as low as 3%. And that's irrespective of any bias on the part of the pollsters. So that's for polls. But when it comes to the election, what happened? According to the exit poll, Trump support went slightly up with every group except for white men. In spite of all the narratives about race, all of the self-assurance on the left that if you're an ethnic minority, then of course you're going to be voting for Democrats, it turns out that people don't owe you their vote, you have to earn it. And it's possible, just possible, that they care more about the jobs that Trump was focusing on and Trump promoted with his message of opening the country up in the face of pandemics than they did about white university graduates tearing down statues. It's also the fact that law and order issues pay a lot better with Latinos and black voters than defunding the police does. The inability on the left to understand that is testament to just how wide a gulf of understanding has opened up between the two political traditions. It's expressed by a paper that was produced on the subject 2 years ago by Musa al-Gharbi that said this about researchers. As it became clear that Donald Trump had a real base of political support, even as analysts consistently underestimated his electoral prospects, they grew increasingly fascinated with the question of who was supporting him and why. However, researchers also tend to hold strong negative opinions about Trump. Consequently, they have approached this research with uncharitable priors about the kind of person who would support him and what they would be motivated by. Research design and data analysis often seem to be orientated towards reinforcing those assumptions. Now, how often have I said it on this channel? If you want to change the world for the better, you have to see it clearly so you understand what's really going on. It's the part that disappears first when you get ideologically opposed factions. They both create myths about the other side that they believe to be unquestionable reality, and yet are partly or wholly wrong. The paper noted that messages that actually resonated strongly with blacks or Hispanics would be ones that the researchers themselves believed to be self-evidently so-called dog whistles to racist sentiment, and therefore they didn't bother to test those statements with those groups. Partly that's because the researchers saw racist messages where nobody else did. That's what happens when you live obsessively within a subculture. And partly because all groups are capable of being prejudiced towards certain other groups, contrary to the contention by the intersectional left that all minority groups are incapable of racism and naturally stand in solidarity with each other, identifying with what they hold to be their mutual oppression. As it happens, black Americans are more supportive of limiting immigration than any other bloc of the intersectional coalition. Hispanics tend to be more concerned about illegal immigration than are whites. Ironically, there's one more factor that's being held to have helped the Trump election campaign, which is that the Republican on-the-ground operation was very well organised and robust, much more so than that of the Democrats. And the reason for that was that the Republicans weren't scared off by the coronavirus, but the Democrats were. All the while, the Democrats are pointing to the research suggesting that Republican rallies led to spreading more COVID-19 infections. Nevertheless, they carried on regardless. And they worked. In some ways, you could say it was the perfect advertisement for Trump's position that America needs to carry on, to open up, to find a way to live with the virus, because you can't be as successful locked down. That was how his political campaign operated, and a few more people will have gotten sick as a result, arguably. But the work got done and the benefit was achieved. It really wasn't smart to have a campaigner who spent most days in his basement. 4 days off the campaign trail to prepare for a debate. Really? Now, of course, the next few hours or days or weeks before this is all finally settled will be fraught, because whoever you are, you will believe that the outcome of this matters a lot. One of the things we've seen climate campaigners claiming through the election campaign, and that includes some, although by no means all, prominent climate scientists, is that this is literally the make or break election. A win for Trump would be the final straw for the climate, the point beyond which there would be no return. Whereas a win for Biden would mean sense and sanity and robust climate action would follow, and the world might be saved. This is how people talk in elections. Every election is the most important in our lifetimes. And yes, we know that people always say that. But this time they say, we really mean it. And so on and so on. You can't have the sensible conversation before polling day because both sides are in campaign mode. But now, from where I'm sitting, a Trump win was never going to be as bad as they said, and I think they genuinely felt. At the same time, Biden is a long way from guaranteeing any kind of effective action. With the first of those, of course, Trump has no truck with climate change policy. I have no doubt there will be a number of examples of that in practice over the next 4 years of a Trump administration. But that said, the world that we live in today, a number of factors are going to push you forward regardless of the niceties. People make a lot out of the Paris Agreement. A big difference between the two candidates. Trump is out. Indeed, officially, America is out of the Paris Agreement as of today. Biden would go straight back in. But international agreements don't actually drive this sort of dynamic. What changes it is action, what will actually be done. People were saying, with America pulling out, that means lots of other countries will follow their lead and it will undermine the global effort to address climate change. It's quaint that America feels it's still so important, but what actually happened in practice is that Europe and China have started competing for leadership advantage in your absence. Now, the Trump administration doesn't care much about climate change, but it does care about economic competition with China. It had already, in its first term, carried out something of a pivot in relation to nuclear power. Seeing China and Russia's aggressive plans to expand nuclear technology profile, the US Department of Energy had begun leading a national initiative on an ambitious timeline, 5 to 7 years, to bring new advanced nuclear reactors to the international market, because they understand that losing their competitive global position as the world leader in nuclear energy would have real consequences in the world we're going into. President Trump got his Energy Secretary, Dan Brouillette, to put together a nuclear energy working group. In May, the DOE released a blueprint for transformative action titled Restoring America's Competitive Nuclear Energy Advantage. And that was a pretty rare bipartisan initiative, which is probably why you don't hear so much about it. So it should consider regardless of the result, because it has geopolitical logic behind it. So it ensures that it remains regardless of the politics of the person in charge. It's one example of how, in a world where the UK, Europe, China, Japan and South Korea have all joined the race to become central to the development of the energy tech of the future, that logic is going to propel the US to compete back, even if the way that it plays out isn't in the form that campaigners would want or to the degree that they would wish. On the other side, then you have Biden. Biden would rejoin the Paris Agreement. That's the part he can most easily do, and which on its own means the least. Sorry. Again, I think it's quaint how Biden supporters think somehow America will be jumping into the fray as the moral leader of the world, pushing the others through firm diplomacy. Well, that's not how the rest of the world sees it anymore. Take this article by Catherine Murphy on the impact of the Biden victory on climate change in the world. International action on emissions reduction will get a huge shot in the arm if the US election goes to the Democratic leader. Biden will bring America back into the Paris Agreement. America will sign up to a net zero emissions pledge by 2050 with an enforcement mechanism. Well, those are all catch-up steps. And nobody believes you'll do the second one in any case, because the thing is that the EU can commit to net zero by 2050. It's gone through the difficult, hard-fought internal wrangling to get the different countries on board, including an expensive programme to bring coal-based countries like Poland up to speed. And China can commit to 2060 because it puts it into its 5-year plan and everyone has to follow it. It's by no means clear that the mere declaration of the target means the United States will actually take the action needed to meet it. After all, the Obama administration tried and failed to get a cap and trade scheme through in 2009 because it didn't clear the Senate. That resulted in nothing much for the next 6 years until they tried again to get the Clean Power Plan to limit carbon emissions by pushing it through the existing powers available to the Environmental Protection Agency, which ended up being ruled on by the Supreme Court. The Trump administration is currently aiming to replace the Clean Power Plan with a countermeasure, the Affordable Clean Energy Rule. It highlights how much easier it is to come up with a big promising, big spending plan than it is to turn it into reality. So, for instance, Joe Biden is a very strong union man. Organised labour has been an important constituency for him, but unions have been divided over radical plans on climate change. The fossil fuel sector is more unionised than green energy, which might weigh heavily on Biden's room for manoeuvre. Whatever the promises in advance of the election, there will always be fewer things delivered, particularly big spending promises that will be hard to deliver. Because even if Biden had the luxury of a majority in both houses, you realistically get a 2-year window to utilise that to make legislation, and you have to choose your battles carefully. Especially if you're hopeful that maybe you can persuade the American people to leave you in that position for longer than 2 years. And there's lots of things people want to see done. If the Democrats dove into the opportunity, frantically trying to cram their most radical fantasies down while they could, well, it would just guarantee that they wouldn't have that window open for very long. And it's probably the fear of that happening that's made it more likely that Republicans are going to hold on to the Senate anyway, even though right now it's still split on a knife edge. All of this process has been very divisive. And the events overnight will have been a huge blow to anyone who might have been hoping that after this election, the polarization that has defined American politics in the last few years would be somehow magically healed. Generally because those people had assumed that Trump would lose, and that would be that. Now, look, there's no doubt that Trump has been a polarizing figure. But of course, the truth is he fed off the polarization. He didn't create it. America's politics, certainly since the beginning of the century, has been marked by the trend towards polarization, where the political sides have moved beyond opposition to mutual dislike, moving on to full-on hatred. The Constitution of America was created by the founders to seek to force compromise to get anything done. James Madison wrote in The Federalist 10 the dangers of extreme factionalism, when people care more about defeating the other side than they do about the common good. And that's certainly been the case in this election, as typified by the extraordinary degree to which the mainstream media has been prepared to squash any normal journalistic curiosity into the man who would be President, Joe Biden, for as long as it took to get the election done. What does the bulk of the American people think about it all? Well, it can be hard to tell through the cacophony of extremism that's given its voice by social media. Twitter, as we know, is not really real life, neither is Parler, nor indeed YouTube. You wouldn't think so. But the pandemic gave a flash of an indication that people could be brought together at some point. In the early phases of a pandemic, 90% of Americans told pollsters we're all in it together, compared with just 63% a year and a half previously. Likewise, the percentage that believed the country to be very divided dropped from 62% to 22%. Now, a lot's happened since that was done, of course, and the polarization quota undoubtedly went straight back up. Historically, pandemics do tend to polarize people rather than bring them together because they push people into isolation and make them scared of the outsider. But also, obviously, as the election got nearer. However, that result in the early stages did show that these moments can pass. So what happens next is pretty important. The UK was similarly divided over Brexit, and it seemed catastrophic and impossible for years. And already now, the impact of that has lifted to some degree. Political activists are still motivated and angry. The country as a whole eventually just got weary of it. They voted for the candidate that promised closure, and whatever debates and divisions we now have in the country, it is much less split than it was, even though the pandemic does divide people, and we're seeing some of that as well. But that was a clear vote. Boris Johnson was given an 80-strong majority. That was for closure. And that's not what we're going to see here. But we do see in America the widespread exhaustion with it all that preceded that vote. So maybe something similar can play out. If Biden does ultimately prevail, which is currently the higher likelihood, and if he's as low energy and low profile in office as he has been on the campaign trail, and you don't get the uber radicals pushing the boundaries, the activists will still be angry. The country as a whole will probably heave a sigh of relief. If the Democrats decide instead that now it's their turn to create drama and push boundaries, then they'll solidify the culture war even more than it has been already, and things will continue to go down. Not least because you can expect Trump to continue to provide a vocal voice of opposition and a rally for his base. And if your ambition is to see Trump campaigning in 2024 for his second term, then that's exactly how you would most likely bring that about. For America to heal, the next government needs to tack to the centre. If it doesn't, then this is going to carry on. The question is this: can you create a politics that is more genuinely liberal in the old sense of the word? There is an absolutely positive discourse to be had between old-style liberals and old-style conservatives, neither of whom are much represented by the current party leaderships. As Jonathan Haidt has observed, illiberalism on each side is making American politics ugly. The relationship matters more than the message. That's why the internet, and particularly Twitter, are the worst places for this, because you don't have relationships and people are trying to show how smart they are. They're trying to show how devoted they are to their team. Part of the question is also what role the media will play over the coming year, because the US media has been part of a polarising trend. It's easy to make assumptions that things are the same everywhere, but it's not what the data show. One study looked at how people in 7 different countries viewed the motives of the news media in covering the pandemic. Only in the US was that seen as a massively partisan equation. The averages were on a spread, and the US was not the most extreme. Asked to agree with the statement, the media seemed to be pursuing their own agenda rather than simply reporting the facts, the majority in each country, bar Germany, said yes, including 60% in the US and up to 75% in the UK. But break that down by political perspective, and the US figures show an astonishing range. The middle groups, the moderates and the politically unengaged, they fit the profile from the other countries in the study. But at the ends of the ideological spectrum, it couldn't be more different. 98% of committed conservatives, which let's face it is within the margin for error of 100%, versus less than a quarter for the 2 most liberal groups. That gap is unique to America. With that wider perception gap in the motives of the news media, it's no wonder that Americans plug themselves into 2 completely different information infrastructures. It's no wonder that you've had Trump is Hitler on the one side and QAnon, Trump is bringing down a network of cannibal paedophiles on the other. Social media has played its part in that as well, of course. Algorithms designed to keep people engaged with content for longer naturally pushes people to the extremes. This we know. Their short-term response for social media companies, which has been to ban some voices and content from their platforms, that's not going to address the basic dynamic that they themselves have created in pursuit of their business model, which is to sell the most advertising. Will they learn from the experience of this election? The media, the social media. I see no evidence of self-awareness amongst any of them so far, so probably they won't. All right, a few questions to leave you with that we can watch with interest. One, what will the mainstream media do now in relation to the Hunter Biden stories they've been determinedly ignoring? Once the election's finally settled, will they regain their curiosity once it can no longer benefit Trump? Indeed, are the people right who think that the Democrats will be content to see a rapid handover from Biden to Harris, either because Biden's mental state is seen to decline further or because of the Hunter Biden issue? Even if that was correct, you probably wouldn't want that to happen within 12 months of the election, and it may well not be correct. But if the Hunter Biden story suddenly got legs, well, who knows? Attached to that is the bigger question. Those in the media that have been so remarkably partisan in the last few weeks of the election, they probably did so believing that it was, just for now. Once the election was gone, they would be back to being the objective centres of journalistic excellence that they imagine themselves to be. Will they? I wonder. A line that's been crossed once is a lot easier to cross again. 2. If he loses, what role will Trump play in the next 4 years? Will he retreat to his business interests, making as much money as possible while hurling the occasional Twitter bombs at his foes? Or will he spend the next 4 years as leader of the opposition, sharpening the appetite of his base for a second run in 2024? If he stays hungry and in good health, you wouldn't bet against him achieving a second term in those circumstances. And 3, if Trump wins, how will the Democrats process that outcome? Will they decide that wokeness has pushed them to a place where they no longer understand the American people and they need to reconnect with the centre? Or will they point at how Biden, being in the centre, was supposed to win it for them? And if only they'd gone for a proper socialist like Bernie Sanders, then they would have won it. Early indicator, if Trump wins, then Antifa will riot. Will the Democrats condemn the riots, or will they be awkwardly silent about them as they were in the run-up to the election? Well, that's all for now. Let me know what your takes are in the comments below as we look forward to the wild ride that is going to be the next couple of days.